When Barron Trump saw a homeless man being harassed by an angry crowd, no one expected him to step in. But what happened next changed everything and left everyone speechless. It was a brisk autumn afternoon, the kind where the wind carried a chill that made people pull their coats tighter. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, honking cars, distant sirens, and the steady hum of conversations blending into a chaotic symphony. On the corner of 5th and Main, a small park sat nestled between towering office buildings. Its benches were dotted with people. A young couple laughing over coffee, a man in a business suit scrolling through his phone, and a group of teenagers gathered around a street musician strumming a guitar. But at the edge of the park, near the entrance to a subway station, sat a homeless man. His clothes were tattered, layered for warmth, and his face was worn with the kind of lines that spoke of hardship and years spent surviving the unforgiving streets. Beside him, a small cardboard sign rested on the ground, its message scrawled in uneven letters. Hungry and cold. Anything helps. Most people passed by without a second glance, their eyes fixed ahead or on their phones, avoiding any connection. A few dropped coins into the small cup at his feet without breaking stride. But then, a commotion began to stir. A group of protesters had gathered on the other side of the park, their signs waving in the cold wind. They chanted loudly, their voices rising above the city's noise. Their cause wasn't entirely clear to those watching, but their anger was palpable, and their focus began to shift. One of them pointed toward the homeless man, and within moments the group had crossed the street, their energy taking a darker turn. Barron Trump had been walking through the park, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He had come here for some quiet, a brief escape from the noise of his world. But as he approached the scene, the tension caught his attention. He saw the group surrounding the man, their voices sharp and accusing. The man cowered, his hands raised defensively, his sign crumpled underfoot. Barron froze, his chest tightening. The scene before him felt wrong, deeply wrong, and though he didn't yet know what he was going to do, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away. The air around the small park shifted, no longer just cold, but tense. The voices of the protesters grew louder, their chants now directed at the homeless man sitting on the ground. "You're the problem," one of them shouted, pointing a finger at him. "Get a job," another barked, their voice filled with venom. The homeless man shrank under the weight of their words, his hunched shoulders trembling slightly. His hands, rough and weathered, clutched his small cup of coins like it was the only thing grounding him. His eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but the group had boxed him in, their signs raised high like weapons. Barron watched from a few feet away, his heart pounding. He had stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. His mind raced. Should he step in? Should he call someone? But the more he watched, the more his chest tightened. The man wasn't fighting back. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't doing anything but sitting there, trying to make himself smaller, as if he could disappear. The protesters didn't seem to care. One of them kicked the man's cardboard sign, sending it skidding across the pavement. Another knocked over the cup of coins, the small change scattering noisily across the concrete. The man let out a soft, broken sound, not quite a cry, but not far from it. Barron clenched his fists. He could feel the anger bubbling in his chest, but it wasn't just anger, it was something deeper. Sadness. Helplessness, a feeling he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. A woman walking by paused, glancing at the scene nervously. She hesitated, then quickly moved on, shaking her head. Barron's stomach turned. Was that what he was about to do? Walk away? Pretend he didn't see it? He looked at the homeless man again. The way he sat there, taking the abuse in silence, made Barron's chest ache. He couldn't just watch. He couldn't let this happen. His heart pounded as he took a step forward, his voice louder than he'd intended. "Hey! Stop it!" The group turned, their angry energy now directed at him. For a moment, Barron's legs felt like jelly, but he didn't back down. He met their eyes, his voice steadier this time. "Leave him alone! He's not bothering anyone," one of the protesters, a tall man with a scruffy beard, sneered. "What's it to you, kid? You think you can save the world?" Barron held his ground. "No, but I can stop you from treating someone like this." The group exchanged glances, their smirks fading into something closer to irritation. The man on the ground looked up at Barron, his eyes wide and filled with something between fear and gratitude. Barron could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he didn't step back. This wasn't just about the homeless man anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it felt scary, even when it felt impossible. Barron stood firm, his heart pounding as the protesters shifted their focus toward him. The tall man with the scruffy beard stepped forward, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You've got a lot of nerve, kid," he said, his voice low but edged with menace. "This doesn't concern you." Barron swallowed hard, his palms sweating, but he didn't waver. "It does if you're harassing someone who hasn't done anything to you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his courage. "You're picking on someone who's just trying to survive. That's not okay." A woman in the group, holding a sign that read, "No handouts," scoffed loudly. "You don't know his story," she said, waving a dismissive hand toward the homeless man. "People like him are why this city's going downhill." Barron's jaw tightened. He glanced down at the homeless man, who was still sitting on the ground, his hands shaking as he tried to gather the scattered coins. His quiet desperation was a sharp contrast to the protesters' loud aggression. Barron couldn't just let this continue. "Maybe I don't know his story," Barron said, his voice gaining strength, "but that doesn't mean he deserves this. He's a person, just like you." The tall man laughed bitterly. "Just like us? You're kidding, right? He's a drain on society, and we're tired of it." Barron felt a surge of frustration. He took a step closer, his eyes locking on the man. "You're tired of it? Imagine how tired he is. You think he wants to be here, begging for change? You don't even know his name." The crowd murmured among themselves, their confidence beginning to waver. One of the younger protesters shifted uncomfortably, lowering their sign slightly. Barron noticed, but didn't let up. The homeless man looked up at Barron, his eyes glistening. You don't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "They'll just move on eventually." Barron shook his head. "That's not the point," he said, glancing down at him. "You shouldn't have to sit here and wait for them to stop. You shouldn't have to deal with this at all." The tall man crossed his arms, clearly annoyed. "Do you think you're some kind of hero?" he asked mockingly. "No," Barron shot back. "I just think it's basic decency to treat people with respect." The tension in the air was palpable. People walking by had started to stop and watch, their curious gazes shifting between Barron and the protesters. A woman holding a coffee cup muttered, "What's going on?" to the man next to her. Another person pulled out their phone, recording the exchange. Barron could feel the weight of the attention, but he didn't let it shake him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. He turned to the crowd of protesters, his voice firm but calm. "You're all here yelling about how people like him are a problem," he said, gesturing to the homeless man. But what are you doing to actually help? If you spent half this energy on fixing the system instead of tearing people down, maybe things would actually change." The younger protester who had lowered their sign took a step back, their expression uncertain. He has a point," they murmured, glancing at the others. The tall man whipped around, glaring. "You're seriously siding with him?" "I'm just saying," the younger protester replied hesitantly. "Maybe yelling at someone who's struggling isn't the way to fix things." Barron saw the shift, small but significant. The crowd's confidence was cracking, their anger losing momentum. Even the tall man seemed less sure of himself now, his smirk faltering. The homeless man still on the ground looked up at Barron with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice breaking. "No one's ever stood up for me like this before." Barron crouched down, helping him pick up the remaining coins. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly. "No one does." As the tension in the air began to dissipate, the protesters started to back off. One by one, they lowered their signs and drifted away, some muttering under their breath, others looking genuinely uncertain about what they'd just done. The tall man lingered for a moment, his jaw clenched, before turning and walking away without another word. The crowd that had gathered to watch began to clap softly. Someone called out, "Good job, kid." Another said, "It's about time someone stood up to people like that." Barron nodded politely, but he didn't bask in the attention. He focused on the homeless man, who was now holding his cup of coins tightly, his hands still trembling. "What's your name?" Barron asked gently. "David," the man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name's David." "Well, David," Barron said, offering a small smile, "let's get you out of here. Maybe grab something warm to eat." David hesitated, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You'd do that? For me?" Barron nodded. "Of course." As they walked away from the park, Barron couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't set out that day to change anyone's life, but sometimes moments like these found you, and it was up to you to rise to them. Barron and David walked quietly along the sidewalk, the hum of the city surrounding them. The protesters had long since dispersed, but their presence still lingered in the back of Barron's mind. He glanced at David, who clutched his small cup of coins like a lifeline, his gaze fixed downward, as if afraid to meet the world head-on. They stopped outside a small diner, the kind with a glowing neon sign and warm light spilling out onto the street. Barron opened the door and motioned for David to go inside. David hesitated, his shoulders tensing as he glanced at Barron. "You don't have to do this," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not your problem." Barron shook his head, offering a reassuring smile. "You're not a problem," he said simply. "You're a person, and right now, you deserve a break." David's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he didn't quite believe this was real. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and a waitress behind the counter looked up, smiling warmly. "Grab a seat anywhere," she said, her tone cheerful. They slid into a booth near the window, and Barron handed David the menu. "Order whatever you want," he said, seriously. David's hands shook as he held the menu, his eyes scanning the options. I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice cracking. "It's been so long since I've had a real meal." Barron waited patiently, watching as David finally settled on something simple, a bowl of soup and a sandwich. When the waitress returned to take their order, Barron added coffee and a slice of pie to David's meal, ignoring his quiet protests. As they waited for the food to arrive, Barron leaned forward. "David, can I ask you something?" he said gently. David nodded hesitantly, his eyes still fixed on the table. "Sure. How did you end up here?" Barron asked, his voice careful, full of genuine curiosity. David let out a shaky breath, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I had a family once," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "A wife, a son. But things fell apart. I lost my job and then my home. One thing led to another, and here I am." Barron's chest tightened. He didn't know what he'd expected, but hearing David's story laid out so plainly hit him harder than he thought it would. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "That's not fair. No one deserves to go through that." David looked up for the first time, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. "Life isn't fair," he said, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "But people like you remind me that there's still good out there." Before Barron could respond, the waitress arrived with their food, setting the steaming bowl of soup and sandwich in front of David. He stared at it for a moment, almost as if he didn't believe it was real. Then slowly he picked up the spoon and took a sip. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, Barron saw the faintest hint of peace on his face. As they ate, a man sitting a few booths over walked up to them. He was middle-aged, wearing a worn jacket and a kind expression. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "That was an incredible thing you did back there, standing up for him." Barron nodded politely, unsure how to respond. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to David. "I run a shelter downtown," he explained. "We've got space and resources to help. If you're ready, we can get you back on your feet." David stared at the card, his hands trembling again. "You mean you can help me? For real?" The man smiled. "For real. But it's up to you." Tears welled up in David's eyes as he clutched the card tightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. He turned to Barron, his expression one of overwhelming gratitude. "And thank you for everything." Barron felt a lump rise in his throat as he nodded. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "Just promise me you'll take the chance." David nodded firmly, his resolve clear. For the first time, Barron saw something new in his eyes, hope. As David held the card tightly in his hands, a quiet but visible shift happened. The weight on his shoulders seemed to lighten, and his posture straightened just a little. For a man who had spent so long on the margins, This moment wasn't just a glimmer of hope. It was the start of something new. Barron could see it in his eyes. The man from the shelter gave David a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We'll be waiting for you," he said warmly. "Just show up when you're ready, no pressure." David nodded, his voice catching as he replied, "I'll be there. I really will." As the man walked away, the waitress came back with the check. Before Barron could grab it, she smiled and shook her head. "Someone already covered it," she said, nodding toward the counter where the man from the shelter was slipping on his coat. David's lips trembled as he stared at the small gesture. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's been so long since anyone cared." Barron leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep going. Take this chance." David wiped at his eyes, his rough hands moving clumsily but quickly. "You don't know what this means to me," he said. "You didn't have to stop back there. You didn't have to do any of this. But you did." Barron shrugged lightly, his voice calm. It just felt like the right thing to do. David's expression shifted, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "The world needs more people like you," he said quietly. "People who actually see us." Barron's chest tightened. He wasn't used to being at the center of moments like this, but hearing those words, he realized how much they meant. Not just to David, but to himself. He wasn't just helping someone, he was seeing the impact, the ripple effect of one simple decision to act. As they stood to leave, a woman who had been sitting a few tables over approached them. "I saw what you did," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was beautiful. You reminded me that there's still good in this world." Barron gave her a polite smile, but inside he felt something deeper. This wasn't about being seen or praised. It was about the simple truth that kindness matters, even when no one is watching. Outside the diner, David paused, looking at Barron one last time. "You didn't just change my day," he said. "You changed my life." Barron smiled, his voice steady but warm. "Then promise me you'll make the most of it." David nodded firmly, slipping the card into his pocket like it was the most precious thing he owned. He reached out to shake Barron's hand, his grip strong but filled with quiet gratitude. As David walked away, disappearing into the busy city streets, Barron stood for a moment, watching him go. The weight of the day settled over him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how much one act of kindness could mean. It wasn't just about what he'd done for David. It was about the message it carried, that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to have a second chance. And sometimes it only takes one person to make that happen. As Barron walked away from the diner, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He hadn't set out to make a difference, but sometimes life has a way of presenting moments that demand more from us, moments where we can choose to look away or choose to act. For Barron, the choice had been clear. He couldn't stand by and let someone be treated with cruelty and indifference. What he hadn't anticipated was how much that single act of standing up would ripple outward. It wasn't just about helping David, though that alone was enough. It was about showing others, those protesters, the bystanders, and even himself, that kindness and courage still have a place in the world. The lesson was simple but powerful. Small actions matter. A kind word, a helping hand, or even just standing up for what's right can create waves that extend far beyond what we can see. Barron realized that the world doesn't change in grand, sweeping gestures. It changes in the quiet, personal decisions to do good, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. David's words stayed with him. "You reminded me that there's still good in this world." It was a reminder that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves to feel seen, valued, and respected. And while we can't fix every problem or help every person, the moments where we can make a difference, those moments are worth everything. As Barron headed home, he felt a quiet sense of purpose. The day had started like any other, but it had turned into something much more. He hadn't just helped David, he had reminded himself, and maybe others, that the best of humanity is found in these small, selfless acts. In the end, the takeaway was clear. We all have the power to make the world better, one small act at a time. And sometimes, all it takes to change someone's life is the courage to care. If this story moved you, Remember that kindness and courage can change lives. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of doing what's right. Let's spread the message of compassion and hope together. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story. Your support helps keep these powerful messages alive.